Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. A lot of people have been watching the Murdaugh trial and have come away with various questions about firearm forensics. So I'm going to try to answer some of those questions, and I'm going to start with gunshot residue. So what is gunshot residue? Well, when you fire a gun, it doesn't just send out the bullet or shot or whatever else, but it also puts out a bunch of bonus garbage. So if we watch this little video clip here, you can see that when they fire this gun, all of that dust and smoke, that's gunshot residue. Once that settles onto a surface, that can be later detected and picked up. So, and I'm just going to note, this is stock video. Don't shoot like this. This person is really Baldwinning it on the gun safety. But yeah, this cloud of stuff is going to be made up of solid particulates, as well as some things that might have been vaporized or liquefied by the heat of firing. And those things that have been heated up will then recrystallize or reharden. So all of that stuff makes a weird kind of soup of things. And that can include like lead dust from the bullet. That can include copper dust if there's a copper jacketing. That can include all sorts of stuff that might be stuck inside the barrel, either from previous firings or just, dirt. That can include bits of the barrel itself, because the barrel does get worn as the gun is fired, but that'll include a lot of burned and unburned and still burning powder, as well as primer compounds. All of this stuff makes a weird mix of stuff. Now, there's various ways that gunshot residue is used in court, and in my view, some of these are good science, and some of these are just ways that bullshit gets into the court, and that can really, I think, have a detrimental effect on the search for truth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how gunshot residue is used and which uses I think make sense and which don't. Now, when we think about gunshot residue, one of the first questions is, what does it do once it gets fired out of the gun? Because we're often trying to use this to kind of reassemble a picture of what's happening. So it's really important that we know how gunshot residue is going to behave. And the problem is that it behaves erratically and sometimes unpredictably. Think about it as if the gun was sending out a cloud of glitter when you fire this, and that glitter is going to land in various places. And like glitter, it's sort of light and unevenly shaped, so it probably doesn't fly all that far. It tends to stay mostly around where the gun is fired. And it may also sort of get emitted from not just the barrel of the gun, but if you saw on the revolver, there's going to be some of that residue is going to come out from the gap between the cylinder and the barrel. Some of it might come out, from the action of other firearms. The problem is that this stuff doesn't necessarily end up where we might expect. So one of the most common questions is, for instance, if you swab somebody's hands and you find gunshot residue, what does that mean? Well, it might mean that they fired the gun. But like glitter, this stuff gets everywhere and can easily be transferred from one place to another. So it might, for instance, mean that you picked up the gun after it was fired, because that gun's going to be covered in residue. Or that you tried to apply aid to somebody who themselves was already contaminated by that gunshot residue. All sorts of ways that can get on your hands. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you fired the gun. It might mean that you experienced some sort of cross-contamination. This stuff cross-contaminates really easily. A lot of the protocols for how to deal with gunshot residue is to be careful, because it's really, really easy to get it from one place to another. But let's say you don't have gunshot residue on your hands. Does that mean that you didn't fire a gun? Well, no. The reason why is because, perhaps unlike glitter, gunshot residue can sometimes wipe off very easily. One very common way that they report that it's been wiped off is you stick your hands in your pockets. People stick their hands in their pockets all the time, especially when they're nervous or stressed. That can be one way people react to that. So that's not great. There's also reports in the literature on this that people who've been crying, that the tears might have washed off gunshot residue. Similarly, they might wash or wipe because, various reasons, and that might clear gunshot residue. But even when people aren't doing those things, there are plenty of situations where there hasn't been gunshot residue, even though they know somebody's fired a gun and they haven't had an opportunity to sort of wipe things off or clean things off, including situations of self-harm where people have fired the gun at themselves and they didn't have an opportunity to wipe anything off, but there was still no gunshot residue found on their hands. So that's a bit of a problem. Gunshot residue can also be used for various other things because, if you think about it as like a puff of stuff coming out of the gun, sometimes that can be used in ways to help us determine how far away the gun was fired from a target. That's actually a pretty good use, usually. But the problem that you'll see is that a lot of stuff goes beyond what I think the science can support. I think that an expert is fully within their rights to testify to say, we found gunshot residue on this surface, or we didn't find gunshot residue on this surface. And typically they're pretty good at identifying what is or is not gunshot residue. There's not a whole lot of things that are going to confuse that. And really the big one is fireworks or other explosives, because those can have very similar sort of compounds and chemical signatures, but you can look into and see if fireworks are really a potential explanation. If it's the 4th of July and somebody's just been setting off fireworks, maybe that's not the most sort of reliable there, but otherwise it's probably gunshot residue. Okay, where does this get into the weeds, and where does this become confusing or kind of making stuff up? And that is when we start getting into the explanations for why there's gunshot residue on something or why there's not gunshot residue on something. This is where you get into not science. So let's say, let's give a hypothetical here. You're in a business relationship with somebody and that business relationship is breaking down. They think that you're taking money from them. They blame you for these losses and they're really upset. You're involved in litigation, there's a lawsuit going on and it's really acrimonious. And then one day you're sitting at home, you don't have your front door locked, and this person walks in the door and they're very upset. They're angry with you. They're in tears. They're just very emotionally distraught. And you say, whoa, 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 like we're involved in litigation. We can't be doing this. And they pull a gun out of their jacket. And now you're thinking things have gotten real. They give you a little speech. They blame you for all of the problems in their life. And then they take that firearm and they use it on themselves. Okay, you're now having a really bad night. You call the police and the police roll up and they find this person and, they do all this and they swab for gunshot residue. And you're thinking, I'm pretty good because I was nowhere near them. I didn't do anything. I didn't even touch them. And so the police then leave. Now, when they do the gunshot residue tests, your hands come back as clean and his hands come back covered in gunshot residue. And you're thinking, great, this backs up my story. But the police have a different theory. And the police theory is that you invited this person over to talk through your differences and then you shot them. That's the police theory. And, now you've got a problem because their gunshot residue expert is going to get up on the stand and is going to use the word that should always put you on alert for an expert behaving or an expert giving you some stuff that might be kind of fudging it. And that word is consistent. Consistent, all consistent means is that it's not excluded by something, that it's a possibility. That is very concerning because there's all sorts of situations where something might be consistent. Let's say you've got a box and you don't know what's in the box, but you'd kind of like to find out without opening the box. Maybe it's Christmas. So you shake the box and you hear something rattle and you think, maybe that's an apple. It sounds like an apple, but it could also be consistent with a lump of coal. That might be the same sort of shape and make the same sort of bumping noises, or all sorts of things, right? You don't know. So even though you might say that it's consistent with it being an apple, you can't say that it's an apple in there. Similarly, consistent with in the field of gunshot residue is going to be a whole lot of things. The evidence that, we've described here is consistent with the story as it actually happened, the scenario I've given you. But the gunshot residue expert might get up on the stand and testify that it's equally consistent with you having fired the gun. Because remember, I mentioned that gunshot residue might not end up on your hands or can easily be wiped off by all sorts of things. And also consistent with gunshot residue being on their hands, because they'll say maybe that person held up their hands to try to defend themselves or to try to, say, whoa, 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 don't do it. And then that plume of gunshot residue ended up on their hands. And they'll say, that's consistent. They might even go so far as to say, we think that maybe that you washed your hands off to try to clear some of the gunshot residue off. And that makes it extra suspicious. And you're thinking, I did nothing wrong. Why is this guy up there saying that I need to go to jail? What is the problem here? Well, again, there is no pattern of that gunshot residue that really tells us much. Because this stuff, as I mentioned, is sort of gun glitter and gets everywhere, but also can be wiped off things very easily. So when they start telling the story of what actually happened with this residue, that's where we're getting into making stuff up. And this is very dangerous because these experts will be told the story from the people who are investigating it and basically told their theory. So that information is going to color how they look at this. It's not just that they're going to say yes or no. They're going to basically be given the police, the police's theory of this. And that leads to the potential of bad information that might convict somebody improperly. All right, so all of that is kind of a mouthful, right? But the real problem here is just that consistency aspect. Another example of the problem with consistent is, let's imagine that you've got a stabbing. And this stabbing, one of the very common injuries, I had a knife here and now I don't know where it's gone. Oh, here we go. So one very common injury that you'll see in a stabbing is where the person's stabbing, their finger slips over and hits this part at the back. So let's say they find the knife after a stabbing and there's blood on the front of the knife, but they also find that little spot of blood at the back. And the police are thinking, we think that somebody's got that injury where they slipped onto their own knife and they cut themselves. Now, they don't have the suspect at this point. They're going to be looking for somebody with that sort of telltale injury, but they do blood typing on the blood because this happens before DNA evidence, right? So all they can do is get blood typing. And let's say they find that on the front of the blade, they've got, I don't know, AB negative. But over here at the back of the blade, they've got O positive blood. So two different bloods. That suggests, again, that we've got this, that sort of cut injury. Now, they find a suspect. They think it's their person, and they do a blood test for this person, and it turns out they are O positive. Okay. So now we can say that their blood type is consistent with the person that they think is the stabber based on the knife. Well, here's the problem. O positive is the most common blood type. It's shared by about 37% of the population. And so if you're talking about we've got it being consistent with 1 in 3 human beings who are alive, that's not super helpful. What we really want is to find inconsistencies. We want to exclude as many people as possible. This is why DNA is such fantastic evidence, because DNA can exclude millions and millions of people and can really narrow it down. So the issue is not the really useful evidence in terms of forensics is not when you hear something being consistent, but when you hear how many possibilities this evidence can exclude. Consistent is a word that every time you hear an expert say it in a trial should raise the hairs on the back of your neck. You should be thinking, this is potentially a problem. Always ask yourself, well, okay, so if it's not excluded, what does that actually mean? All right, so let's have a look at some of the evidence from the Murdaugh trial about gunshot residue, and I can sort of comment on some of that.
And how did you determine specifically where you were going to check to see if there were any particles?
So typically when we're looking for gunshot primer residue, we're looking for somebody who was in the vicinity to the discharge of a firearm. For this particular case, we were provided information that something might have been transferred in this item that had gunshot primer residue on it. Therefore, we treated it like an item that needed to be checked for transfer.
Did you catch that? Yeah, they fed her their theory of the case before she started work. And so that wouldn't be a big deal if we were talking about something that's sort of a hard scientific question, like what is the blood type of this? Or, are there drugs in this? Or something like that. But in this case, we're talking about something that's a little bit more interpretation and assessment and a certain amount of making stuff up. And so that's a problem here, because she might have come to a very different theory of things if she wasn't fed that information ahead of time. In a better world, simply this detail of she was given their theory of the case ahead of time should disqualify her from providing any sort of evidence on this topic. Because what we've seen is a lot of forensic evidence where the assessment seems to change to fit the police theory. This should really be something that, if it's a real science, can be done and get the same results regardless of what the police say they're hoping that she finds. Because it's not, this is a real problem, and there needs to be some insulation there. Why do they not do that? Well, because if they did insulate it, she might come back and say something that is not consistent with their version of things and not consistent with what they want to find. Can't have that. All right, let's keep going.
Was there a lot of gunshot primer residue inside of the jacket?
I would say there were a significant number of particles characteristic of gunshot primer residue on the inside of this jacket, yes.
How many did you determine?
I confirmed 38 particles characteristic.
See, this part I've got no problem with. Assuming that they've done things with proper lab technique and they've been careful to avoid cross-contamination, keeping in mind it's really easy to cross-contaminate in this area. You handle one thing and then you handle another without changing gloves, and you might have accidentally moved gunshot residue to that new thing. So assuming that they were careful to do that, then simply noting the presence or absence of gunshot residue here, not an issue. That is something that the science can support, and so no issue with this testimony. Let's keep going.
It could. I would have had to still check the morphology. I would have had to make sure that they were molten around. I also would have had to check that they didn't contain exclusionary elements like high amounts of iron and magnesium.
When she's talking about exclusionary elements, she means things that they're looking for that might be a hint that they're looking at something that superficially looks like gunshot residue, but isn't. In particular, when they're talking about iron and magnesium, those are things that are not super common in firearms, but are very commonly used in fireworks. So that's why they're looking at that. Okay, let's keep going.
That it's on the inside in order for it to be consistent with transfer. An object or objects with a high amount of gunshot primer residue on it would have had to transfer to it. So they would have had to have more gunshot primer residue particles on them to begin with in order to transfer the amount of gunshot primer residue I found on this coat.
And as far as a recently fired firearm, would your findings be consistent with that item containing a recently fired firearm?
It is possible, yes.
With that number of particles?
With that number, it is possible.
Is there any other possibility? You stated one. Are there any more?
If the jacket was inside out and simply in the vicinity to the discharge of a firearm, it could have also had that number of particles on it.
I'm going to give her some points for using language like it's possible to make it clear that she's not certain here. A lot of experts don't, and I think she's doing a better job than most. She also gives this one hypothetical of, maybe it was laying on the ground and somebody fired a gun near it. The problem is that there's a ton of other possible hypotheticals here. Cross-contamination could explain this. Or let's say there's a jacket that was worn by somebody who wasn't involved in this at all, but they take it off and they throw it on the ground and it lands sort of face down on something that is contaminated. The simple fact is we don't know how those particles get on there, and she doesn't know any better than the jury does. She doesn't actually bring anything to the table here when she's talking about how that's possible. All these are her theories, and these are her theories that have been pre-contaminated by the police officer's case. So I think this is a big problem. We've ventured outside of science into something that, in my view, should not be in the courts. But the courts disagree with me on this one. The courts say there's no problem with this. I disagree with the courts. I would love to see the courts come around to better scientific procedures for expert evidence. All right.
If a recently fired firearm was wrapped up inside that jacket, would that be consistent with your findings?
There is a possibility of that, yes, sir.
Thank you very much. That's all we have. Thank you.
So 2 thoughts here. The first thing is that where I am, if you walked up to start touching the witness like that, you would get tackled before you made it. I have no idea why he's allowed to keep walking up and touching the witnesses. I think that's kind of weird, and unless she's giving permission, he ought not to be doing that. That's kind of creepy. But regardless, I will give her points again for saying that's a possibility. The problem is that it's just a possibility. We haven't excluded that, but we can't say that that's what happened or that it's more likely than any of dozens of other possibilities. We just don't know. I actually like her a lot better as an expert witness than most expert witnesses I've seen in this field, because she seems to be really saying, like, listen, that's possible, but we don't know. And I will give her serious points for that. Lots of other experts, when you see them testifying about these kinds of issues, will try to give a false impression of confidence on that. I think she does that a little bit, but not nearly as badly as she could have. So I'm going to give her some points. I'm not super upset with this witness. I do think that we have serious problems with admitting these kinds of conclusions with respect to gunshot residue evidence. No issue with saying we found it on the inside of the jacket, but these witnesses don't give the jury anything more in terms of their assessment of why it's there than the jury would have themselves. I don't think that this is, in a better world, this should be disallowed. Unfortunately, we don't live in that world. Anyway, I hope that this has been a useful explanation, and we've got some sort of examples from trial footage here for the Murdaugh trial. Let me know if there's questions you have. I'll try to answer those possibly in a future video or possibly in the comments below, but please like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to see more content. I also want to thank my Patreon supporters at the $50 level, CCFR, David Michaud, and Canada's National Firearms Association, as well as the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. At the $30 level, Sights and Arms Limited and Jane Babe and Luxor. And at the $20 level, Lindsay Metcalf, Kyle Fox, Haywire, Gerald to the Bailey, Cameron Johnson, Andrew Elsich, and Vicky. Thank you as well to my $10 supporters who will be in the crawl immediately following. Thank you for watching. I hope this has armed you with knowledge. See you next time.